Hi, my name's Terry Wheeler, and I'm going to share with you my testimony about what the Lord did for me and through me. And I'll say at the beginning, this is nothing I did right because I did everything wrong. This is what the Lord did, taking the mess I'd made and the bad situation I created and turning it into something good and that bore fruit for His kingdom. So this story starts back in the 1980s. And if you can imagine my life as a puzzle, and the Lord is the one putting the puzzle together. The first pieces of the puzzle were starting being put in place in the 1980s. I worked at Continental Tire in Mount Vernon, liked my job, but on the side, I loved doing forestry work. Always been an outdoor person. When I was a kid, I grew up in the woods, and it was like a place of magic. I could go there and get away from everything and see wildlife and nature and the beauty of it. And that was a place I went to enjoy myself. And then I was blessed later on in life to be able to be doing it as a profession and getting paid to do what I did for free as a kid. So my wife likes to tell me, if you can make your passion your profession, you'll never work a day in your life. And that's where I'm at. Well, the first piece of this puzzle was put in place. My wife, Loretta, of soon be 30 years, was a college student. She was started at Murray State. She was going to become an elementary education teacher. She went there for one semester and decided that was not the field she wanted to go into. She came back home and she enrolled in Southern Illinois University in the School of Social Work to be a social worker. And then she worked when she graduated, and after we got married, she worked for 24 years as Director of Social Services here in McLeansboro at the Hamilton Memorial Hospital. And was a blessing to many people, and people still comment on her, the way that she helped them during times of need. So that's the second piece of the puzzle. The first piece of the puzzle was having her change to become a social worker. I bought in 1984 40 acres of property in the southwest part of Hamilton County. I lived in Mount Vernon, as I said. I worked at Continental Tire. 10 years earlier, my brother had bought 25 acres and this joined it. He lived up north in LaSalle County and worked at Caterpillar Tractor Company in Aurora. And he had to go there to have a job because when he got out of high school in the 1960s, unless you went to coal mines, there was no jobs here. And the good jobs are all up north. So he moved there like many other young people did and made his life up there. But anytime he had a chance, he would come down here on the weekends and holidays because he never fit in up there. That's where he had to be to make a living, but he didn't like it. Totally different world up there. So when I got this 40 acres, I had gone through a divorce in 1984, and this was the way I dealt with it. I would get off work on Friday night. I would go down and spend the weekend by myself, never see a person. I bought a chainsaw. This 40 acres I had was landlocked. There was no access to it. I built a road with a chainsaw, cleared out a campsite, had a little pop-up camper, and I would pull it in, and I would stay there all weekend. I'd never see a person, and I would work. And that was the way I dealt with my hurt. Instead of turning to alcohol or drugs, the way a lot of people I worked with at General Tire did when they went through divorce. And my brother and I did more and more development. We built trail system throughout. We put up nesting boxes for wildlife, and it was just like our own little park, own little paradise. And I got more and more involved in forestry work. Then I started doing forestry work. I was befriended by the district forester, Gary Stratton. He was the first one that came out and showed me how to manage timber property. And he soon after that got promoted, and his replacement was David Johnson, who was a dear friend and still is and was my mentor. Took me under his wing, and he made it his mission to turn me into a private consulting forester. He was a brilliant man, but very humble, and not your typical government worker. He wasn't a bureaucrat. He wanted to be out in the woods working, and he loves to teach people. So I would work on 3 to 11 shift, Monday through Friday. I'd get up in the mornings. David would come down and pick me up. I'd spend a half a day with him out in the woods, him teaching me forestry management practices, how to identify trees, how to do timber stand improvement, variety of different practices. Then he'd drop me off at noon. I'd clean up. I'd go to work. And I did that 5 days a week. Then I enrolled at Southeastern Illinois College, had a school of forestry, and went to school there. I still worked at Continental Tire. I was there for 32 years. But in my free time and the weekends, I would do forestry work. Bought a tractor and got into tree planting, and eventually ended up planting over 2 million trees. I became friends with an adjoining landowner because thieves were stealing trees off his property. He was an absentee landowner. He had no idea what was going on. I contacted him, told him what was going on. We became friends. And eventually, he was a doctor, and he was wanting to make investments. So I would find land that joined his property, was for sale at a good price, and he would buy it. We ended up having 1,300 acres of ground altogether that joined out there. And I was nominated for and became the 1993 Outstanding Tree Farmer of the Year in Illinois, and was nominated for National Tree Farmer of the Year twice, once in '96 and once in 2003. So forestry kept becoming a bigger and bigger part of my life. In 1987, I'd become a friend with the people that lived, the closest house to us was a little over a mile away up the road. They were new residents. They'd moved in from Waltonville. He was a coal miner. And moved up there, and I become friends with them. And they had 2 daughters. One was away at college. The other one was a junior in high school. And she was a country girl, a tomboy. And I kind of took her in, taught her how to hunt, taught her how to, I'd take her fishing, let her ride her ATVs, take her arrowhead hunting, just kind of like a little sister. Well, in the meantime, we'd built a cabin, and the place, just every year we'd make more and more improvements on it. And it was kind of Hamilton County's best kept secret. If you didn't know what it was, you'd never find it. It was a half a mile down a dead end road back in the woods. You couldn't see a light or a house or a power line or anything. So it was very remote. And this young girl asked one time if she could bring some friends of hers out and camp. I said that'd be fine, but she knew her way around. So when she came out that evening, I opened the gate, let them in. It was her and 3 other girls, and one of them was this girl, Loretta Anderson. And she became, later in life, my wife. So I met her at this place. My brother and I had lots and lots and lots of good times and laughter and fun at this place. My wife and I eventually got married there where we had met. We had it for a number of years. A lot of friends came and used it for hunting, for camping, for fishing. It was just like our own little private getaway, our own little park. And as I mentioned, my brother worked at Caterpillar Tractor Company. Here's another piece of the puzzle put in place. He'd been there for 42 years. He was 60 years old. And his body was up there, but his heart was down here. I knew he wanted to come home. And 120 acres came up for sale that was in the middle of all this property and had a house on it and a barn and a pond, a really pretty place. So I called the doctor that had been buying all this ground, told him about it. He bought it, so I called my brother, said, I've got a place for you to come. And he knew he was familiar with this place. I said, any chance you could come down here? He said, I can't, so I've got to work 2 more years or I won't get my retirement, his benefits. So, okay, the following Monday evening when I got home from work, he called me, said, "You're never going to believe what happened." Said they called me in the office this morning, first thing, my boss did. Said, and they're wanting to do a buyout of senior employees. And they're offering me more money to take the buyout and retire early than I would make if I stayed and worked. He said, so I'm taking it and I'm coming home. He said, we're going to fix the house up and live there. So that got him down here. And you'll see later on why this piece of the puzzle was important. So fast forward in the early, say 2000 to 2009, I was really involved in forestry. I was doing as much work as I could. I loved it. I was passionate about it. Met many people, made a lot of friends through it, and I was trying to be a good steward with that facet of my life and try to leave things better for the next generation than what I'd found it. I'd witnessed a lot of deforestation in my youth. Used to be a lot more trees in the county, and everybody was clearing it out so they could farm it. And I wanted to try to reverse that process somewhat if I could. So I was able to plant a little over 5,000 acres of trees. A big part of those were in this county. So I was managing all the land that this doctor had. I was doing a timber practice called timber stand improvement. It's akin to weeding your garden. You go into an existing stand of timber, you pick out your crop trees that you want to grow to maturity, you cut off parasitic vines from them because they can retard the growth of the tree. You cut down trash trees, cull trees, trees that are competing with the crown of that tree and robbing of sunlight, and you open it up. The process of doing this, it looks like a tornado hit the woods because you've got all these trees that you cut down. But to me, I love it because as soon as you're done, you look and every tree you see left standing is a beautiful tree. And it really accelerates the growth rate of the tree and makes your timber more valuable. This is good for wildlife. You create a lot of good habitat and nesting habitat for deer and turkey and rabbits. And you create a lot of food and browse food because the stuff you cut down, then the deer can eat the buds and twigs that they couldn't reach before. So it's a smorgasbord for them. I'd been working on a 140-acre tract, and I'd worked for 3 days doing timber stand improvement. And January 9, 2010 was the coldest day of that year, and for running a chainsaw, the colder it is, the better it is, because it's really strenuous and you get really hot. And you're packing this saw through the woods for 7-8 hours a day, and bending over and cutting and hard work. And I've always loved hard work. I love to work. Learned to do that at a young age. I grew up very poor, and I learned if I worked, I made money. And if I made money, I could buy a fishing pole and plugs and rod and reel and a bicycle, and the world was my oyster. So work was a good thing. Had that instilled in me, and I've still got that. So I'd been working for 3 days on this 140-acre tract. It's 19 miles southwest of McLeansboro. It's over a mile to the nearest house and then 3/4 mile to the nearest road. Very remote area. That morning it was 12 degrees. The wind was blowing 15 miles an hour, and we'd had snow on the ground for a number of days, probably 8 to 10 inches of snow. So before I left the house, my wife, I told her what I was going to do, and that morning she said, why don't you stay? I don't want you to go today. I want you to stay home. Of course, me, I was all gung-ho. No, I got to get this done. It was a Saturday morning. So I went ahead and I left and ignored her protest. I went out there. I'd been working for about an hour, and I was just walking through the snow and walking to where I hadn't cut, just kind of working my way and making a giant circle. Working around, I'm wearing a protective hard hat and a helmet that has a face shield on it, has earmuffs, and it's kind of like a horse with blinders on. You can't really see that good. It has a bill that sticks out over the top of it. I was 56 years old, and I was starting to get arthritis in my neck, so I wasn't doing what you should always do anytime you fell any tree. I wasn't always looking up. I was cutting a bunch of smaller trees. So I thought, well, if they should fall on me, they're not going to hurt me. So I was just going through the woods, and there was this big hickory tree that had fire damage. So I cut it down to release a bunch of younger oak trees that were around it. And it fell over at about a 50, 60 degree angle. It didn't come down. It was on these smaller trees. And I thought, well, I could go cut those smaller trees, lay it all the way to the ground. But if I did that, it's dangerous because those trees are torqued over. And if you start to cut into them, instead of just falling down, they can break and snap and shoot out like a missile. They can impale you and kill you. So I thought, well, this is a remote place back here. Will nobody be around this? I'll just leave it and let nature melt it down. So I went on my merry way, and I'm cutting and cutting and cutting and not looking up. And about an hour later, without realizing it, as I said, I was working a circular pattern. I ended up back under that tree without knowing it. So I'm cutting small trees, and I cut a hollow sassafras tree, but it had a cavity in it. It went down. As it went down, in front of me, behind me, this giant hickory tree came down upon me. I didn't know what was going on. The sky fell, and all of a sudden I'm on the ground, and crashing, snapping, and breaking. So I had just filled my chainsaw up with gas before this happened. Just had. If you'll keep count of how many pieces there are here, if that's the way you want to call them, with this puzzle that makes this work out to good, I count 34 of them altogether. I like to think of them as miracles, as God's intervention. I can see His handiwork all through this. And there may be more than 34, but that's what I've looked back and counted myself. But I just had filled this chainsaw up. I just had bought this saw. It was new. I had taken off my heavy coat and left it at my ATV. I was a mile back in the woods from our cabin. I'd driven my truck to our cabin, then I went out we had a pole barn there, opened the barn up, got on the ATV, got the saws. I wore a backpack that I kept bottles of gas, bottles of bar oil. I kept extra chains, sharp chains, and snacks and drinking water. That way I could put this backpack on. When the saw ran out of gas, I didn't have to try to figure out where my gas jugs and bar oil jug was. So right there I would fill up and keep going. I could cut all day long. So I had this backpack on. Now back to where the tree fell on me. The saw is laying by me, still running, but it didn't get into me. So no accident there. And I'm struggling, trying to get free, and I can't move, and I think, well, there must be a limb behind me that's got this backpack trapped. And I struggle, and I struggle, and I struggle, and I can't get free. I start running out of wind. So I stopped to take a break to catch my breath. When I did, I turned and I looked to my left, and my boot on my left foot was by my left cheek. And I knew right then, you're not going anywhere. And I didn't know it at the time, but my right leg was just as bad behind my back. It had crushed both bones in both legs from my knees to my ankle. The x-rays, when I got to see them, looked like 4 train wrecks, like cars all sideways, if you can imagine your bone. Called them shatter fractures. So all I was able to move was my left arm. I could extend it down to the ground. I could reach the chainsaw that was still running. When the tree fell, the saw did not get into me. It landed on the ground to where I was able to reach it with my left hand. And I could reach up into my pocket and reach my cell phone. So first thing I thought, thank you, Lord, I get to say goodbye. So I got my phone. I called my wife. When she answered the phone, she started talking. She was all excited. She said, "Guess who's here? Stephanie just walked in. Stephanie's here with the kids." This is one of the 3 girls that came with a neighbor girl to camp that night at our cabin. And she was a close friend of my wife. She was in our wedding. She was a matron of honor. And she was a strong Christian, faithful Christian. So when I called to give my wife this news, my wife is not alone. She has her good friend who's a Christian there to support her. There's another piece. She said, "Stephanie's here with the kids, and we're going to make a pot of soup and this and that, and you get home, we'll have a good meal." I said, "You need to stop talking. I got some bad news." So she gets quiet and said, "I've had an accident, and there's a tree on top of me. This is going to be our last conversation, so I want you to listen pretty close. I want you to know I love you, and I thank you for the best 17 years of my life. You've been a tremendous blessing. I do not want you to be angry or bitter or blame God. I want you to go on with your life and make the best of it. You're going to have a good life." She was real still, and she said, "All I know to tell you is pray." So I said goodbye to her. Then my next phone call, I called my brother, Dennis, the one who I said moved back that worked at Caterpillar. All my life, he was my best friend. I had a wonderful Christian mother and a terrible father, but my brother was 5 years older than me. He always looked out for me. He filled in the void left by my dad. He was so good to me all my life. So I called him, and he was 20 miles away in Benton, and told him what had happened, and thanked him for being the best brother I could have ever hoped for. Told him if I'd got a catalog, I couldn't order one better than him. Told him I loved him, thanked him for everything, thanked him for being my best friend. Said goodbye to him, but he said, "I'm not saying goodbye." He said, "We're going to get you out of there." I said, "Don't get in any hurry getting here, because I'm not going to be here when you get here." He said, "Call Dwayne." That was a mutual friend of ours, the closest house to us. He was a mile away, Dwayne McFarland. I said, "Okay, I'll call Dwayne." I hadn't called Dwayne in probably 7 or 8 years. He had a cell phone, but I didn't know his number. But we were good friends. He would come up to the cabin and visit with us. But he had an unlisted landline. I hadn't called this number in probably 7, 8 years. It wasn't in my phone, but that number came to me as clear as could be. So I called that number, and he had caller ID. He was in the other end of the house, but his daughter looked at caller ID, saw who was calling. She said, usually he wouldn't answer the phone because of telemarketers or whatever. He didn't get much use on that landline. But his daughter Leah said, "Dad, I think I recognize this number." So he came and he answered the phone. There's another piece of the puzzle. So he answered the phone, so I tell him what's going on. And Dwayne was born and raised there. That was his home. And he's very wise. He has good presence of mind. He's good at solving problems. So he said, okay, and he was able to understand where I was at because his father's property joined this, and he'd grown up out there. He knew this land pretty well. He said, me and Leo get in the backhoe, and we're heading that way because it was snowy and icy, as I said. So he starts coming. In the meantime, Loretta had called the sheriff's office. My cousin was sheriff at the time, Greg Brenner, and Greg was off. He'd had a kidney stone taken out, and he was home, and he was under pain medicine, so he couldn't come, but he dispatched his deputy. And then Greg's son, Michael Brenner, he came because we'd all deer hunted out there, and Mike knew where it was. So Loretta called her cousin, Daniel Bishop, and his wife, Angela, and they'd lived with us the first year of their marriage. We love them like crazy, and they're more than just family. They're very close, very dear friends. So they came over to the house, and got Loretta, and Angie drove the car out there because Loretta was in no shape to drive. And she said she was like Mario Andretti going around those curves, but she made it. God took care of them. They got to the cabin where I'd left the truck. Daniel gets the truck to drive. They called Harry Ambulance Service here in McLeansboro, and they drove down to the road that led back into where I was, a mile back in the woods. It was 3/4 mile from the cabin. Met the ambulance, and they let them in. They had to drive across a low-water crossing on Rector Creek with about 2 foot of running water in it. But Mike didn't hesitate. With that new ambulance, he splashed off in the creek and drove up through it. He and 2 paramedics, one was my neighbor, Mr. Sandusky, and then another one were in the ambulance with him. They drive a quarter mile back in the field down this path that I'd made, and the ground was frozen. They get to the woods where my forest trails started. I had 15 miles of forest trails I'd built out there and maintained. So they had to leave the ambulance. They get all the equipment. The 2 paramedics and Mike Harry get up in the bed of the truck. And Daniel and Angie and Loretta in the cab. There's a 4-wheel drive diesel. And away they go down the road, down the ruts and stuff through the pathways. They get almost back to where I'm at, and the truck gets stuck. So they get out of the truck, and they grab the board they're going to carry me out on, and all their equipment, and the neck braces, and all the stuff. So they all take off, and they head over to where the tree is. Okay, now back to Dwayne. He and Leah come down in the backhoe. They got the backhoe stuck, trying to get to me, if you can imagine that. But they get back there. Dwayne does. And I described to him where I was, but picture in your mind 3 days of cutting with a chainsaw on a 140-acre block of timber, trees down everywhere, my tracks in the snow everywhere, and 15-mile-an-hour wind blowing with gusts on top of that. So he's like, where is he at? Remember me saying that I was able to reach the chainsaw? All this time, that chainsaw on its own sat there and ran. Remember I said I just had filled it up with gas. There's another piece of the puzzle. So periodically, I would rev that saw up. He heard the saw. So he came in that direction. He got on the back side of the tree where he knew I would be, and he told me later on that he stopped for a minute to catch his breath and to collect himself because he didn't want to fall apart when he saw me, and he knew it was going to be bad. So he did. So he came around the tree and he saw me, and he said he's still haunted by that image, but he said that you could have put me in a foot tub. I was 6'3.5", and when the tree come down on me, I was like 3.5 foot, all squashed up in a ball. But I'm still coherent. I never passed out. I never cried. And I'll step back a little bit. After I'd called Dwayne and called and said all my goodbyes, and I'm there alone, I did as Loretta advised me, and I prayed. And I told God I was ready to meet my Lord and see my mother again, who passed away in 1977. And while I'm laying there, this hollow sassafras tree I told you about that I cut, coming out of that hollow tree, a little flying squirrel comes out of his winter sleep. He comes over onto me. He walks up in my chest, right in front of my face, and looks at me, blinks a few times, and then goes back and crawls in his log. And I thought then, even here in my last minutes, what I thought was the last minutes of my life, here's something beautiful. In any situation, if you look, there's something beautiful. I guess I watched Pollyanna one too many times. But I remember that little flying squirrel. And I felt bad that I'd messed up his house because he lived in that hollow tree. So, anyway, Dwayne gets there. And he gets to looking, and this big hickory tree, it's not all the way to the ground. It's about a foot off the ground, and all between the ground and the tree is me. Had it come on down, I would have been dead instantly. But there was one bent over small hickory pole tree that was holding this tree up, barely. It landed perfectly centered on this tree. There's another piece of the puzzle. So he's afraid to touch anything. He's afraid the tree will go ahead and come on down. So as I said, Dwayne has good presence of mind, so he calls his brother Kevin, who lived down the road from him. Kevin and his father were both deacons at the church that we went to before we came to the church we're at now, which is Hopewell Missionary Baptist Church in McLeansboro, the best church you could ever go to. The church that I had looked for all my lifetime, and the Lord led me to because of this accident. It was one of the fruits that came out of this accident was me being at this church, Loretta and I. And I can happily say we are now home. We're where we were meant to be. But his brother Kevin and his father, they farmed, and good Christian people. But if you knew Kevin and his dad Norman, the thing about them, if they had a tool, if they could find it, it probably wouldn't work. So Dwayne called Kevin. Here's another piece of puzzle. Kevin happened to be home because he's a busy guy, and he pumped oil wells, and he farmed and had livestock and cattle. But he was home in the kitchen. The phone rang. He answers it. Dwayne tells him what's happened. He said, I need a hydraulic jack. And Kevin, who usually couldn't find anything, and if he did, it probably wouldn't work, he said, I'm standing here looking at a new one in the box I got for Christmas on the kitchen floor. There's another piece of the puzzle. So Kevin grabs the jack, gets on his ATV, he heads the mile up in the woods to get back to where I'm at. So Kevin shows up, and before this happened, when Dwayne and I were there, it's getting really hard for me to breathe. I'm getting where I can't get my breath. This backpack, the two straps on it, is really pulling tight against my chest. I thought at that time that was why I couldn't breathe. There were other reasons, but that was part of it. So I told Dwayne, I said, if you would, take your knife and cut these straps so I can breathe. He said, I don't have a knife. I said, well, you're going to have to take that chainsaw, fill it up with gas, rev it up, and remember I said I could move my hand from extended down the ground to reach the saw. I could reach my pocket, my bib overall pocket. I was able to reach and get my thumb under that strap. And I told Dwayne, I said, you rev it up and use that saw. He said, no, I'm not doing that. I said, if you don't, he was afraid it would get into me, which probably could have happened. If you run it slow, I knew it would. I said, if you don't, you're going to have to watch me die or turn your head because I can't breathe. So I could tell he was nervous, but he filled it up with gas. He revved it up. I said, now let me get my thumb under here, and I pried it away from me about an inch or two. I said, rev it up and just barely touch it. And he did, and it popped like a rubber band. Then he took a breath, and I was able to reach over and reach the other strap, pry it away. He popped it, then I could breathe. And then his pulse rate started coming back down a bit. So Kevin shows up with the jack. In the meantime, Dwayne had been cutting pieces of wood off of a log I'd cut down, a fallen tree, to use for blocking. He set the jack on those blocks, got it under the tree, jacked it up, got the tree off of me, then I could breathe better. At that time, then the Loretta and Daniel and the paramedics, and Mike Harry, show up and find me in the woods. The deputy sheriff had showed up. He was out in the field about 1/8 of a mile away in the squad car, and he was able to get back there. They'd call for a helicopter for medevac. He gave them the GPS coordinates so they knew where to land at. And had Dwayne's dad's field was an open farm field, so they landed in it. So I'm back in the woods about an eighth of a mile. Loretta gets there. She sees me. When she sees me, we say goodbye again because you figure every breath's going to be your last. And then they're getting ready to get me out from under the tree. And I told them, I said, before you start this, I said, get Loretta out of here. I don't want her to watch this. I don't want this to be the last thing she sees. So Daniel and Angie take Loretta over at some distance behind a tree. She can still hear what's going on, but she's not looking. I didn't want that picture in her mind because I knew it wasn't going to be good. So they get all the braces and stuff around me and backtrack one more time, back to before they got there. Once Dwayne got the backpack straps cut, I said, now pull me out from under this tree. He said, no way. He said, I'm not touching you. I'm not moving you an inch. So he didn't. Okay, now back there getting ready to put me on the board. Well, they had to bring my legs around to get them on the board. They were like spaghetti. When they started moving them, I was groaning pretty good. I never cried, but most pain I ever felt. And they get my legs on the board, and they had to use bungee cords to keep my legs on the board because they were like noodles. They get me slid over, and when Loretta called the sheriff's office, they activated the emergency rescue team here in the county. So about 30 volunteers showed up. My brother said that the woods was full of people and full of angels, looking back. So they're clearing a pathway. I'd ridden my four-wheeler back from the cabin, and then I'd walked with my saw. So they've got people in front of them moving brush out of the way while they're carrying me on the board. They get me over to the four-wheeler. They set me on the back of the four-wheeler, then people clearing path in front of it so the four-wheeler can drive through the woods. They get me to the truck, which they'd gotten freed up, and that pathway goes on out to Kevin's dad's field. They set me in the back of the truck. They drive me out to the helicopter. Then they put me in the helicopter. Then before it takes off, Loretta's there and said goodbye again. We figured that would be it. And then I remember there's like a little pod that they had me in, little compartment. Well, I was too big for the thing. They tried shutting the door on it twice, and the third time I remember he really slammed it, and I was like a sardine in a can, but I was in there. So up and away we go. And Dwayne's brother Jerome was there, and he said they kicked the four-barrel in once they got above the trees and said it was off like a bullet. So we go to Deaconess Hospital in Evansville, and they'd given me some kind of medication because I was kind of twilighted. But I was still coherent and aware of what was going on. I remember we landed the helipad at Deaconess downtown, get me on the gurney, and they started to wheel me in the door. And coming out of the door, I remember seeing this man comes up. I think he was like 85 years old at the time. His name was Brother Bud Seaford. I'd never met him, but he was a pastor at Hopewell Missionary Baptist Church. My wife, as I said, had been social services director at a hospital. She knew him through the Ministerial Alliance. And he was the real deal. He was a godly man, humble man, and he visited anyone that he thought in the community was hurt or wounded. He went 19 years and 6 days, 7 days a week without going into the hospital and the two nursing homes in town to visit people. And the reason he missed the day in 19 years and 6 days is because he had a quarantine that wouldn't let him in. He was over there to see a young man named Brandon Biggerstaff who'd been in a bad car wreck the previous week. And he was in very bad shape. He heard that someone from McLeansboro had been in a bad accident. So here this man comes walking out. He stops the paramedics. He said, "You care if I say a quick prayer for this man?" And the last thing I remember is that man of God praying for me. 4 days later, I woke up on the ventilator. I was out for 4 days. I was on the ventilator for 5 days. And come to find out, I had broken most of my ribs. I'd crushed my rib cage. I broke my shoulder. I had an L1 burst fracture in my L1 vertebrae that was like a hand grenade went off in it. And they had to build me a new vertebrae out of the pieces that was left of mine, plus donor bone from a cadaver. And they were going to amputate both my legs, but the orthopedic surgeon said he was going to try something, didn't know if it would work. But where I had bones before, he ran down through the pieces of those bones rods. And 6 screws on the ankle bone and 6 screws on what was left of the knee bone, on 2 rods on my right leg, 1 on the left, and kind of made me the bionic man. As I said, one rod on the left leg because the small bone was so bad that it couldn't be fixed, and my left leg's kind of bowed. And I was in intensive care for 5 days. Then they transferred me next door to intensive care. I forget the name they call it, but it was still not the regular hospital. But if anything went wrong, they'd rush me right back to intensive care. So I was in a lot of pain, on a lot of drugs. I hate drugs, didn't want to be on it. I told the doctor I didn't want to take drugs. He said, you have to or your body won't heal. So I was loopy and I had lots of hallucinations and all kinds of stuff. People came to see me. My cousin, who was the sheriff, came to see me twice, and I still to this day don't remember it. But I remember those hallucinations as clear as a bell. And I thought, why in the world would anybody willingly want to take drugs? The Lord made me plenty goofy enough being sober. I don't need to get more stupid. Hey, it'll make you stupid. But it was a necessary thing, so I did it. And I found then that I had, all my life, I always wanted to do for others. There was an old church song that I used to sing at the church I went to. Others, Lord, yes, others, this let my motto be. Lord, let me live for others, that I might live for thee. And that was my approach to life. I wanted to be a giver, not a taker. I wanted to be an asset, not a liability. I always had a problem with letting people do things for me I wanted to do for everybody else. But I've since had my eyes open and realized that if everybody was givers, there'd be nobody to give to. And at that point in life, the Lord knocked me down to where I had no choice but to let people do for me. I was flat on my back. I was in a hospital bed for 90 days. They made a thing called a turtle shell they would put around my back. I couldn't raise up more than 20 degrees if I didn't have that thing on. So I forget how long I was at Deaconess Hospital. Then they were going to send me to a nursing home, the hospital. That's what they were going to do with me for rehab. But as I said, Loretta changed her major. Remember back at the beginning of this? And she was a social worker, so she knew what my legal rights were. And she went nose to nose with the social worker at Deaconess Hospital. And she got me put in Deaconess Health South Rehab Hospital, which you stand a much better chance of recovery, full recovery and rapid recovery there than you do in a nursing home. That's just the way it is. So I got transferred to there. So I stayed there. I was on strong antibiotics. They had IVs in both my arms. They were afraid that I was going to get infection. The bone was compound, came out of my leg on my left leg, and they were terrified that I was going to get a blood clot that would kill me in my sleep because of all the trauma. But the Lord took care of me, obviously, or I wouldn't be making this recording. And I learned what I knew, but I learned in practice that the Lord's bigger than any problem you have. And no matter how bad the situation looks to the world, he can take something that they think is bad and turn it into something good and bring fruit out of it, and that's what he did. So at Health South, I had to go and do therapy twice a day, morning and evening. My brother Dennis, who I said had moved down here, was over there with me every day. A friend of mine, my wife rides horses. I did until this happened. And we have a permanent campsite. We've had this will be our 21st year down in the Shawnee National Forest. And a guy I'd become friends with that camped up the hill from us lived in Evansville. I said, you need to meet my brother, because this guy was an avid deer hunter. And I said, I got a brother you need to meet. So he became part of our gang out the cabin. Another piece of the puzzle, by the way. And then when this happened, he lived at Evansville, just outside. So my brother and my wife both stayed at his house, and he and them would come and be with me throughout the day. I had somebody with me. I was hardly ever alone until they had to go home at night. So my brother would wheel me down in the morning and the evening. The nurses would come in and transfer me to a wheelchair from my bed so that they could take me down there to the other end of this hospital where the therapy department was. And it was very good therapy. Those people were angels. I met Christians while I was in that hospital. I remember the respiratory therapist, she was giving me breathing treatments. She would pray for me while she was doing that. I remember another lady, a nurse, came in and gave me a Bible. Then I remember Jerry, this black lady. She was an RN. Her son was the music minister of a big church in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and she was a woman full of faith. She came in, and I couldn't eat because of all the antibiotics. I couldn't stand food. I lost 60 pounds while I was going through this. And anything I'd eat wouldn't stay down. So she came in one night, just like doing her rounds. It was about 2 a.m, I think, if I recall. She said, honey, is there anything I could get you? The cafeteria's closed. The only thing I could take and keep down was V8 or tomato juice. For some reason, I craved that stuff. Anything else I couldn't keep down. So I said, honey, is there anything I could get you? She said, I'll go open the kitchen up and fix you. I said, how about some tomato soup? So off she went, come back, and she fed me tomato soup. And she said, why are you still here? I said, because I can't get up and walk out of here. She said, no. She said, why are you still here? Why are you still alive? She said, I can look at your chart and tell you should not be alive. You should have died. You need to ask yourself, why did the Lord keep you here? This lady, I'll probably never see her again this side of heaven, but I love her. And she was God sent. She was one of many pieces in the puzzle. But she got me to, that question stayed on my mind. Because I knew I should have died. Everybody knew I should have died. So anyway, I had to stay there until I was able, by doing all this therapy and building strength up in my legs and everything, to where I could raise my legs a foot off the bed. I had to get to where they could set me up with this turtle shell on, and I could move on a board from the bed to a wheelchair. Once I got to do that, then I was able to come home. Well, finally did that. So I got home, and Loretta came to get me. A Christian friend that I work with in General Tire, he and his wife had a big Cadillac, and they insisted that she drive it because it had big soft seats and wide doors. So she brings me home in that. I get to the house, and there's a handicap ramp been built so the wheelchair can go up in the house. Loretta, again, being a social worker, had talked to the Jim Inman. He run a medical supply company here in our county. And he had hospital beds set up and everything I needed, and bedside commode and everything, all I need, bedpan, everything I needed. So I'm home, but I still require 24 care. And throughout this deal, many people gave money. I found out later, the first day, and I didn't get there until the afternoon, but General Tire Insurance lady, she told me when I went and saw her on my last day, once I was able to, the medical bill for the first day was $192,000, not counting the $20,000 helicopter ride plus the ambulance. And then the next day they started doing lots of surgeries. And I feel confident they spent over $1 million keeping me alive. So I'm home, but I have to have 24-hour care. I have to take medication every 2 hours. They had me on morphine, Percocet, all kind of pain medicine. So I never slept very good, but I just catnap, and I was not able to roll on my side or anything. I had to lay flat on my back for 90 days. And the good thing about that, again, I guess I watched Pollyanna too many times, but the good thing about that bad situation, for 90 days, all I could do was do what I didn't do in the woods that caused this. I could look up. And I had the best prayer life I've ever had. And I had 24 hours to pray in between eating and talking, and visiting. So lots of prayer time, quality prayer time. I remember my brother, he would come in the mornings before my wife left to go to work. He'd stay with me all day, 5 days a week, until she got home in the evening. Neighbors came over. We had 4 horses. The tractor that we used to put out bales of hay with, something on it, I forget what it was, messed up. A friend who was a mechanic, he came and fixed it. Put the hay out. Friends helped with everything. And this person who wasn't used to letting people do things for me found out that it's not such a bad thing if it's done for the right reason, and I wasn't trying to mooch off of somebody. So I swallowed my pride, which I read in a book says is sin, and allowed people to love me, and they did. And I spent, I forget how many, maybe 2 weeks I was home. In the middle of the night, I remember I coughed and I had a sharp pain in my side, but I had so much pain it didn't really register because everything else was hurting. So I didn't think anything about it. So the next day, Loretta goes to work, and she called home every day at lunch to see how I was doing. And she's talking to me, and she said, "Your voice doesn't sound right. How's your breathing?" I said, "Are you short of breath?" I said, "Well, yeah, kind of. Voice is kind of weak." So, another piece of the puzzle. By working for 24 years in the hospital, she learned a lot about medicine and medical treatment and healthcare problems. She calls my carrier and sends the ambulance out, and I was at 74% oxygen level. And what had happened, that sharp pain I felt when I coughed, one of those many broken ribs punctured my left lung. And it was filling with bloody fluid, and it collapsed. So back in the ambulance I go, and back I go to Deaconess Hospital. 6 more days in intensive care and back into surgery. They have to drain my left lung, and they get over a gallon of bloody fluid out of it. Then it's collapsed, and I have to do exercises and different things. They call it incentive spirometer and breathing exercises to try to get my lung back. The lung doctor told me, the pulmonologist said, "You'll live on one lung if you have to. You know, many people just have one lung." He said, "But if we can get it back, we for sure want to." So I regained back some of my lung. I don't have all of it. And my rib cage was crushed, so I can't take deep breaths. I shallow breathe. Sometimes I run out of wind, but I'm still blessed to be here, and I'm thankful. I'm not complaining about anything. So we go forward, and let's see, November 17th of that year. So it's about 10 and a half months later. I go for my final doctor visit. I had to go, once I was able to get out of bed after 90 days, I took my first 2 steps with a walker. I was able to walk with a walker, stationary walker. Then I got a walker with wheels on it. Then I progressed to canes, or crutches, and then canes. And finally able to get around. I was able to get on my horse, set on my horse the end of July and ride around the yard. And rode in the Fall Festival Parade in September that fall. And I asked my doctors if I could do that. He said, "Your back's not fully healed, don't fall." Said, "You could be paralyzed." But anyway, God took care of me, and we rode in the parade and everything was fine. But November 17th, I went and saw my doctor. His name was Dr. David Eggers. He's the neurosurgeon that built my vertebrae for me. I had to go see him every month. The ambulance would take me over there, and then I was able to drive over myself. Every time I go in his office is in a big building that joined the hospital. He's probably in his 50s, but good doctor, busy doctor, many patients. And every time he'd come in, he'd see me and glance at me, look at the chart, and then he'd hand the chart to a physician's assistant, and he'd walk out. He's always in a big hurry. But that day, my last day, he came in, he was by himself, brought the chart in, laid it down on the table, sat down in a chair, and started talking to me. He said, "Mr. Wheeler, I want you to know in my entire career, that's the worst fracture I've ever seen that didn't result in the patient being paralyzed." He said, "You completely destroyed your vertebrae. If they would have moved you 1/8 of an inch, you'd have been paralyzed, before the paramedics got there." He said, "I can't tell you how happy I am that you're able to walk." Which to me said, God healed you, I didn't. The orthopedic surgeon that saved my legs, pretty much the same speech from him. And he was smiling and happy and so glad the way it turned out. So that was 2 doctors telling me God healed you in so many terms, which I'd already figured out on my own. So I get back home, I resume my life. I can't go back to work at Continental Tire because I can't stand for long periods. I have to sit down. I have many limitations I didn't have, but God healed me enough that I'm still able to do forestry work. So I did that, and I mark timber sales and I plant trees, and I'm my own boss, and I can take as many breaks as I need to take and still make a good living. And our finances, I had to use my 401k and cash it in, but I could do that without penalty for a medical, reason, and wiped it out to pay off bills. But we got all the bills paid except there was one $10,000 bill we still had to pay off. And Loretta said, "I don't know what we're going to do." I said, "Well, it'll work out. It'll be okay. He's got us this far." As I said, November 17th was my last day. I was over near the Wabash River heading to go to my doctor's appointment, and my cousin called and told me that my aunt, Michael Brenner, and the sheriff, it was Michael Brenner's grandmother, the sheriff's mother. And she was like a second mom to me, and she was a dear lady. Her and her husband, he filled in the gap, he and my brother did, that my father left by not being a good dad. Loved them both. She called to tell me, "We lost Mom this morning. She passed away due to cancer." And so the day I was released was the day she passed away. I got home, and 2 nights later, my cousin, the sheriff, called me, said, "Terry Wayne, I need you to come down here to the house. Said, got something for you. Okay. Went down the house, and he and his sister and his stepbrother were there, the three of them. And my uncle passed away that spring. Then she passed away November 17th. So I think it was the 19th. They called me down there, said, Mom left you and Mom and Dad left you an insurance policy that they paid up policy, and it was for $10,000 in interest, and it paid the bill we didn't know how we were going to pay. The Lord was with us, step after step after step. He put all the pieces in place to this puzzle that was my life, and now to get to some of the fruit that it bore. Once I was able to go to church, the first thing I did once I got home, Loretta told me where Brother Bud Seaford was the pastor. Come to find out, it's only 3 miles from where we live. I just never met him. I came to church and I gave my testimony. First time I did it. I've done it 12 times now at different churches. But this was the first place I came. I saw people in the crowd with tears in their eyes because this church had been praying for me. And this man that prayed for me had been involved in many miracles of healing. I was just one of many. And I started coming to this church and moved my membership here. And I've been here ever since. But that was one fruit this led to. Another thing that happened because of this, my brother Dennis, whom I loved, in 2015 or 16, mentioned all this metal. I've got a plate in my back. I've got 3 rods and 4 plates in me. I got 2 plates on my left leg, 1 plate on my right leg, 1 rod in my left leg, 2 rods in my right leg, and a plate in my back. In cold weather, the colder it gets, the more pain I feel. And I have dear friends who live in Florida, and he sang at our wedding. I was a groomsman in their wedding. I called her up and asked her out for him because he was so bashful he wouldn't do it. He didn't think she'd go out with him. They've been married now 40-some years, 42 years. And it got really cold, and they're always wanting us to come visit. So I went down in February and stayed with them for 2 weeks. As soon as I got off the plane down there, pain wasn't bad. But I was really hurting up here before I left. So my brother Dennis took me to the Evansville airport, Evansville, Indiana. I flew down there, stayed 2 weeks. Then the night that my plane came back, he came over to pick me up. We got as far as Mount Vernon, Indiana, and he said, there's something I got to tell you. I said, what's that? Well, one of the many friends we'd made in our deer hunting group out at our cabin was Dr. Terry Hall, who's the surgeon that my wife worked with at the hospital here in McLeansboro. My brother for years had had a lingering cough, but my brother wouldn't go to the doctor. And Dr. Hall started hunting with us, and he finally talked Dennis into coming in. Just come in and let me do a check and see what's causing your cough. He agreed to do it. Well, while I was gone, they did a CAT scan on him. My brother said, I got to tell you, I've got lung cancer in both lungs, and it's terminal. So my world come crashing down again. So first thing I said, he pulled in, we talked there in Mount Vernon. I said, told him I loved him. Said, again, best brother I could ever hope for. And I said, are you ready to meet the Lord? Because he wasn't a Christian when I went to Florida. He said, that's been taken care of. His daughter Tina, my friend Billy England, and I had witnessed to him for years and prayed. And while I was gone, Billy witnessed to him, and he got saved. And when he died 2 years later, he was a babe in Christ, but he was a Christian. And I held his hand when he passed away. Other fruits that have come from this, and I asked my brother, I said, and he told me, he said, I got saved. He said, and the reason is, he said, what I couldn't deny, he said, was what happened when the tree fell on you. He said, God did that. He said, no way should you have survived. So the Lord used something bad in the world's eyes to be something good in his eyes. And it led to my brother's salvation. And when he told me that, I said, then I'm glad it happened. I'd do it again in a minute. I said it was worth every bit of it. So that was one of the good things came from it. Another good thing, my friend Dwayne McFarland that I mentioned, he's not been a Christian, and he was very against the church. He and his father, he was the oldest of 5. He and his father had a lot of conflict. His father was a very devout man, and Dwayne was a rebel. But because of this, Dwayne says, doesn't tell me, but I know I'm the one person he'll talk to, and he listens. Dwayne has come to this church and heard my testimony, and Billy England, my friend, and I have witnessed to Dwayne, and I think Dwayne will get saved one of these days. He's heading that way, and he's acknowledging God, and I think that'll be one more thing that'll come out of this, because he told me, he said, that was a miracle. He said, there's no way around it. He said, God had to have done that. You shouldn't have lived. And little side note, I told you we rode horses. We're riding up the hill down at our horse camp, and friends of ours from this county have a campsite just about a block up the hill from us, and they had a friend with them on their porch. As we rode past and we said hi, unbeknownst to me, it was the pilot of the helicopter that flew me out to Deaconess when the tree fell on me. And his friend, Ronnie Gibbs, said, there's the guy you hauled out the tree fell on. And the pilot said, you mean he lived? Nobody thought I was going to live, except the Lord knew I was going to live because the Lord spared me. And more fruit that's come out of this. I'm not a singer. I'm not a composer. My wife can tell you, if she tells me something today, I'll probably forget it tomorrow. But the Lord has given me songs to sing. Songs of praise, songs of invitation. I think, I haven't even counted them, shame on me, but I think probably around 15 of them. And been able to share them here at church. And we have a community of Amish in our county, and they have actually had me sing the songs to them. They record them on like an answering machine. They got a recorder, and they've taught them to the youth group at their church. And we're hopefully one of these days, we've got them recorded, some of them put down on CD here, but hopefully get them put to music where we can sing them here at church and everybody use them, or maybe other people sing them. But it's been a blessing to a lot of people in many ways. I'm closer to the Lord than I ever was before this happened. I was guilty of looking around when I was cutting trees, but I was also, instead of looking up, but I was also guilty of living that way. I was looking around at all the work I could do every minute I have, and money I could make, and things I could get from my wife. My wife grew up very poor, as I did, but she had a worse situation than I did. She never knew her father. Her mother had mental problems, and she pretty much raised herself. So I wanted to try to make up as much as I could by getting her things, providing her a good life, things I knew she loved and enjoyed. And those things take money to get. So I gladly worked to make all I could to try to make her life better. But I've learned since then not to go after things, even for others, the way I used to. Not to look around at the world, but to look up at God. Go after the things He wants me to go after. And by doing that, He's blessed me, and our standard of living is better now than it was back then. We've not lost anything. grown in faith, grown in love, grown in friends. I have a church that I love, that loves me. I can use this witness as a ministry to give people comfort, to help build people's faith, and to hopefully lead anyone who doesn't know the saving grace of my Lord Jesus Christ. An example and show you, no matter how far down you get, no matter how dark your situation may be, how far away from the Lord you are, the Lord is always as close as a prayer. And He will save you anytime, any place. And my life almost ended that day, but the Lord took that and turned it into something good. And He can do the same for any lost person. If you don't have the blood of Jesus covering you, if it hasn't washed away your sins, if you haven't asked the Lord to save you from your sins, all you have to do is ask. It's not God's will that any should perish, but that all come to repentance. God doesn't want us to go to hell. He wants us to come home to heaven with Him. And if we end up in hell, we have nobody to blame but us, because it's there. The price has been paid for it. All you have to do is seek and ask, and He will save you. And you'll have a new life. You'll have an eternal life, an eternal home in heaven with Him. It's my hope and my prayer that anyone who listens to this will heed that call. If you don't know Jesus, I beg you, get on your knees, ask Him to save your soul. May God bless you.
When your time comes to meet the dear Savior, and the Lamb's book is opened up wide, will you be happy when you hear His statement as He reads what is written inside? Will it be a great time of rejoicing? Will you wear a big smile on your face? Or will it be a time of deepest sorrow? Be a time of regret and disgrace? Will you claim as your Savior my Jesus? Has His blood washed away all your sin? Or will you be doomed by all your transgressions, and then you'll be cast out and condemned? So I beg you, dear loved ones, please ponder, for you're nearing that fork in your road. You'll either go live in heaven forever, or make hell